Good day, everybody. Welcome to my own video recording. Unfortunately, I've run into a bit of a time crunch, so I've had to utilize a software for this video recording different than what I've used before. So you'll see the format and design is slightly different, somewhat consistent with what you guys would have made during your own video recordings. But in any case, here it is. So today our topic is about China, and this is our video episode, which is going to precede our in-class discussion of what's happening in China, and we have a lot of materials to discuss. And as a prelude to that, I wanted to create this video, which also enables us to understand some issues independent of the case that we're reviewing, although we'll focus on the case for our class. In other words, I just want to lay some groundwork around what's been happening in China, where's it going, and who are the important people in the context today. And some of the issues will not be surprising, maybe some of them will be more surprising. I can ask you a question, and this is one I like to ask in class, but what was the best year to be a child in China? Now, clearly in this one-way communication, we can't really get an answer to that, but we do have the situation that it could have been in the past, could have been in the present, could have been in the future, when it was the best year to be a child in China. If we go way back into the past, we had a country that was growing very, very quickly. A lot of really interesting things happening across the country and some commensurate changes. It was a time of growth and optimism and so forth. The present day is a little bit different because we're now facing a bit of a population squeeze. We saw that begin with the one-child policy that was instituted in 1980 and then ended in 2016. And more recently, now we're up to a 2 to 3 child policy. As some of those demographics that have been pressing their way forward in China have been realized in terms of the aggregate statistics for what's happening in the country with respect to its population. So we do see some real challenges. We've seen birth rates declining and death rates declining as well. The consequence is we have an aging population, and one where the growth rate is really slowing down. This is happening both in the city and countryside. And it's happening to the point where actually we do see the population in aggregate numbers actually becoming less and less, to the point where the expected population by the year 2100 is as little as 750 million. Absolutely dramatic changes in the population. Really fascinating in many ways. Again, why has this happened? It's happened because of great improvements in terms of healthcare and life expectancies. In a period of just 30 some odd years, we've seen the life expectancy increase by almost 10 years. Really great progress in that regard, and probably room for another 8 to 10 years of improvement in life expectancies. But the birth rates have fallen off, which has led to that inversion of the population pyramid. So whereas in the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, China benefited from tremendous demographics, it's now in the opposite situation where it's facing the challenging demographics that confront nations such as Japan, but also many mature European nations like Italy, for example. The biggest difference between China and Italy and Japan the biggest differences are reflected in two numbers. Number one is the duration with which the country has been generating high annual GDP per capita. For Italy, it's been in centuries. For Japan, it's been in decades. For China, it's been in years. So as a consequence, the level of wealth accumulation in China is much less than in Japan, and even much less, of course, than in Italy. The second relevant number is what's the aggregate size of the population. Dealing with a population crunch is easy in a country like Singapore, 5.7 million. It could be potentially manageable in a country like Japan, 120 million. And it could be manageable in a country like Italy, much less than 100 million. But for a country of 1.4 billion, the demographic challenges are something that cannot be immigrated away. In other words, it has to be addressed at an internal level. And that's a real challenge. It's a challenge in so many ways, and the challenge is exacerbated by the imbalance in gender ratios. Now, different agencies publish different statistics, and I've seen some agencies that actually say there is no gender imbalance, but I tend to see more that reflect a gender imbalance and the more that do not. So I tend to reside in the group of people who believe there's a substantial gender imbalance in China to the tune of potentially as many as 70 million men who are eligible for marriage, but given the number of women in the economy, probably cannot find a partner if they want a woman as a partner. This is reflected in the numbers here, where in any one age group, from the ages of 35 or less, there's 3 to 4 to 5 million more men than women, which is really quite profound in many, many different ways. We can see the male to female ratios, males per 100,000 females, 112, 114,000, 116,000, 115,000, 113,000, 111,000. So 10 to 13 to 15 to 16% more men than women in any of these age strata. This is problematic because it exacerbates the issues related to the number of child per woman required to sustain the population. In other words, it's not just 2.1, it's probably 2.3 or 2.4, which makes it all the more challenging. Some numbers project the excess to be about 70 million men. Now, unfortunately, this graphic did not translate well into this software, so you'll have to go to the PowerPoint to see the original for this graphic, but I encourage you to do so. But India, like China, or China like India, faces an unbalanced population. This creates challenges with matching replacement rates, particularly as birth rates fall and death rates fall as well. India is not quite there yet, but it's moving in that direction, and maybe in another 2 or 3 decades, it'll be in a similar situation to what China is now. And it also creates challenges with respect to social stability, because you're having large numbers of people, namely men, who cannot have families or other social stabilizing influences that are so important towards the development of a constructive society. You have villages where women have emigrated to larger cities, and as a consequence, there are even more substantial gender imbalances in those economies, in those regions. So it's a very, very big issue, and it's why I suggest that for the current generation, maybe not the best time to be a child. In fact, for the current generation, meaning your generation, you're going to face substantial challenges with respect to managing dependency ratios. Over here, we can see how the dependency ratio is changing as the older, those over 60 increase in number very, very quickly, whereas those who are younger, the 15 to 59, who are supposed to be working to support the older, are actually decreasing. So that really conflates the dependency ratio and increases the need for the young to create a lot for the old. Whereas before, a lot of young could each create little and in aggregate support a much lower burden of old and young people, but that's not the case today. Fewer young people, more older people, and higher dependency ratios even when we consider the children. So the best year to be a child, probably 20 years ago. These days, not a great year to be a child, because you know what? It's going to lead to substantial burdens on each individual to support that aging populace, particularly as there's not that wealth effect where that populace has the money to be able to support themselves. So people who are 70, 60, 80, in that range, they've worked hard, but they haven't accumulated enough wealth to sustain themselves in general. It means instead of living off the accumulated wealth of those individuals need to live off of the excess wealth created by those who are currently working. And that's a big challenge. And it's a big challenge if the economy doesn't reform, which is an important underlay to why we want to see the economy reform from one that did a lot of basic manufacturing, low wage but good jobs, to one that has really high wage and powerful jobs, as we no longer need 4 people to support 1, now we need 1 to support 2. So consequently, it's a very simple item to picture that we need much more value creation per person. Now, when we think about value creation in the economy, we want to think about, hey, how did China grow so well? We know there's endless stories about the great, great economic growth that has occurred in the country over the past 30 to 40 years. But what was the foundation? Where did this growth come from? We're going to refer to 3 separate but connected items: wealth accumulation, in other words, capital accumulation, development of infrastructure, enabling institutions, and the expansion of the educated populace, both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the general skill level or the education level. So this is, again, coming back to these ideas for total factor productivity. Where did we see most of the growth come from in the economy in China? It grew from capital accumulation, development of roads, rails, bridges, machinery, equipment, so on and so forth. And it came from growth in labor market participation, growth in terms of absolute numbers, as well as in terms of the general skill level of the population. These two also feed into some kind of productivity gains. But what I'm going to be saying to you, what I am saying to you now, is that the growth in capital accumulation, growth in labor market participation is beginning to peak. And there's the easy gains from those have been made, meaning that it's much more challenging in the present to continue to grow based upon those. Moreover, there's been a decline in China's total factor productivity. Why has this occurred? It's occurred because the economy is maturing. And so the easy gains from productivity that were achieved by leveraging technology gathered from other jurisdictions is diminishing. Not because companies' abilities to gain that technology is decreasing, but simply because China is reaching the technological frontier. So in many areas, such as e-commerce, there's no longer models that one can look to imitate. The innovation has to be indigenized. And that's a big, big part of the economy today. And a lot of the discussion is, how can innovation grow? This is a very similar topic to what we discussed with Singapore, although the Singapore ideas predated what's happening in China by about 1 decade or 1 generation. But now China faces the same challenge, which is how to develop indigenous innovation to create world-leading companies, but also develop better jobs, increase TFP as part of the economic gain, and to see what's going to be the future economically. But then the question arises of, do the current set of institutions suit that drive forward? The institutions that were developed suited an economy that was oriented towards manufacturing efficiency, manufacturing effectiveness, manufacturing excellence. Those institutions that were created enabled China to become the world's manufacturing heartland. But those same institutions might not be consistent with an innovation-based open economy, so to speak. Again, this is consistent with what we've seen happening in our Singapore case, in our Japan case, where we had great growth under one institutional model, but then how could this model be pivoted? Singapore has been pivoting. Japan has really struggled to pivot. If the ability to pivot is contingent on the size of the economy, well, Singapore is a simple one. Japan's a complicated one. China being 10 times, 14 times the size of Japan, 12 times the size of Japan, pardon me, is going to face a much more challenging pivot in that sense. So to summarize, China's growth to the present day was developed largely from the creation of enabling institutions. Very smart capital injections, generation of factories, better farming equipment, that were gathered through massive inflows of capital, as well as coupled with very high savings rates. All of that enabled the correct institutions to be developed to facilitate economic activity and economic exchange. This was supported by dramatic labor increases from rural to urban migration, as we needed fewer farm workers for any given plot of land. Female participation rate has always been good, longer hours of work as well, and also great education levels or increasing education to support not only expansion of the labor force, but also an elevation of the labor force. And that's going to continue in the present day with respect to labor increases in terms of educational levels, but with respect to participation and growth of the workforce, of course, that's challenged by the demographics I mentioned previously. Enabling institutions won the day. Great levels of FDI, great industrialization, huge income and wealth growth. But what kind of economy did it generate? Well, you saw this in class, that it developed an economy that was focused on distributed manufacturing. And realistically, now the challenge has moved to the core functions or market or market adaptation, downstream functions. More upstream, more downstream, more value creation, less of the economy focusing on manufacturing. Now, at one point in time, meaning about 5 to 8 years ago, close to 50% of China's GDP was generated from manufacturing activities. That's an absurd number. It doesn't happen anywhere in the world except in China. Moreover, that absurd number becomes in the largest or one of the largest economies of the world. So very high percentage of manufacturing as a contributor to GDP as opposed from the primary sector or the tertiary sector, and also a very large economy as well. So again, we see just how important manufacturing was not only to China, but also to the rest of the world. But that's starting to be dismantled, which means we need a greater percentage of the economy moving into the services sector. And in mature economies, we usually see 60 to 70% of the GDP being generated from the services sector, a much lower percentage from the primary sector, depending on how much mining activity takes place in the economy, and then maybe 20% from the manufacturing sector, but certainly not 50%. So how is this going to happen? Where will it happen? And this is part of the decoupling that's occurring, as well as the reconfiguration of the economy away from simplified manufacturing. So there's a new normal emerging. Yes, China can no longer be the world's manufacturing heartland. It is time for change. But can the phenomenal growth continue with this new changed environment? That's a big question. So we've actually touched on this sometimes in class, that there's been shifts in the external environment which create new incentives for businesses. It's changed the cost structure, altered the feasibility of various types of businesses. In other words, this refers to the escalation of the wage rates in China, as well as the decoupling of some of the great supply chains that exist, or great agglomerated ecosystems that exist in China. There's a higher cost structure, there's skilled labor, domestic competition. So what's going to happen? We're going to see some business relocation inside of China, some business relocation outside of China. But more importantly, the first bullet, we're going to see upgrading, skills development, and expansion of business activities in China away from that manufacturing area. So then the economy becomes less like the below and more up to my right-hand side of a sophisticated, world-leading technological leader. That would be a much different iteration, and really part of this fascinating change that's occurred in the country from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2010 to the 2020s, where there's just such rapid change and evolution in the economy. But again, the question becomes, how can this occur? It doesn't occur just because we will it. It occurs because we have the right institutions in place, and it occurs because we have the right will to drive this. So when we think about this kind of growth, we have to go a step back and say, what do companies want? For a long time, companies were so attracted to China just because of the potential for market size. The allure of 1 billion people, and the same could be said for India, the allure of 1 billion people can draw in a lot of investment. So there was a famous Harvard Business Review article that said, hey, if I could sell a shoe for every foot in China. Well, they forgot to ask the idea for that foreign investor that you better make sure you have a positive margin on that shoe. Otherwise, a negative margin times a shoe for every foot equals massive losses, which what can happen is we forget that we operate in competitive operating environments. We have good competition, but we also want to have good conditions under which to operate, which would mean labor costs, exchange rates, so on and so forth. We also want stability, political constraints, transparency, rule of law, and equitable competitive environment. I would argue that these latter 5 points are where we need to see development in order to foster the growth of innovation, productivity, and more importantly, what I would say is indigenous innovation in China's companies. Now we're seeing some of it. Definitely e-commerce is absolutely fascinating. What's happening with Pinduoduo, JD.com, and so on. Payments is another area of world leadership in China. But is that sufficient as evidence that there can be innovation, or is that just an isolated pocket of innovation? So we'd say the easy part has been done. China's opened up to competition. It's corrected infrastructure deficiencies. Not only has it corrected infrastructure deficiencies, it has world-leading infrastructure in so many areas. Wonderful airports, great ports, high-speed rail, normal rail, good good roadways, and even now developing infrastructure for EVs. But what changes need to be made along institutions, transparency, corruption, equitable competition? So if we do not see this institutional development, will there be the chance to receive that high value-added investment at the upstream and downstream areas that are so necessary? So what is the prospects for future growth? So the first step in this is to look at what's been happening since 2012. 2012 was a watershed year because that was when President Xi was his first year in office. And it was at that time that the first major action was taken against Bo Xilai, who was expelled from the CCP and was given to face prosecution over a case about his wife and murder of a British business person. That was the first step in the direction of starting the campaign against corruption and reformation of the CCP. Another thing is that there was the creation of what we call the CCDI. I'll talk about this. And that was where we, using the powers of the CCDI, up to even by 2012, 13, 14, there were almost 500,000 officials who had been disciplined by the party for corruption and other areas. So corruption has been a big area to focus on. Number one, because too much corruption will destroy or reflect negatively on the CCP and hurt its legitimacy. And secondly, it just doesn't work very well with respect to the growth of an economy that's advancing quickly into areas of innovation and greater levels of wealth development by any one enterprise. So the so-called Killing Tigers, Swatting Flies campaign has been actively ongoing for a number of years. And the ideas that the factionalism that exists in the CCP is being reduced. The competition is being more centralized towards one faction, and this creates a substantial decrease in the constraints around the operation of the CCP and around President Xi. So now with the authority that has been reestablished very clearly, there comes a chance to execute policies at a very, very rapid pace. But we have to also ask questions about whether with the elimination of some of the factionalism, elimination of some of the counter voices, whether enough heterogeneous opinions are reaching the senior leadership to enable good decision-making to be made, effective decision-making to be made. It's really fascinating to see how Xi Jinping is taking on multiple roles and amassed a tremendous amount of power in China. President Xi has control over a number of key posts that were historically distributed across different officials in order to avoid the same situation that occurred during Mao's time, when there was unbridled power and some really disastrous policies implemented that led to famines, deaths, and low economic growth all at the same time. So Deng Xiaoping had created some changes, him and his team, through the 1980s and 1990s that reduced the ability to centralize power, but those have all been countered. And the plausible reason on the surface is that this is to help address corruption and other endemic issues that need to be changed. And to enable that change, there has to be sufficient power invested in the dominant authority, because change is always disruptive. So if we have that power vested in the authority, and if that authority is acting in the best interests of the state, then that power can be used to implement those difficult decisions that need to be made. One of the fascinating policies that occurs in China, consistent with those difficult policies, is what I call detain and retrain. You will notice this in one of the questions I'll ask you during our introduction to this class. But this detain and retrain is actually historically embedded in China, where a regime takes over and legacies of the old regime, or even within a given regime, who do not necessarily abide by the dictates of the current regime, are detained and re-educated, or as I say, retrained. But retrain rhymes better with detain. So instead of detain and re-educate, I say detain and retrain. So the idea is these individuals are held in extrajudicial sanctuaries to undergo this kind of retraining. So there's two kinds of, there's many examples of this. One of the more recent ones, or not so recent one, pardon me, but more recent when I first started thinking about these issues, was this Meng Hongwei, who was a former president of Interpol, who was boarding a flight back to China, and subsequent to that flight, or subsequent to that boarding, there was a detention and a loss of connection of that individual. There was another person, Xiao Jianhua, who is a Canadian citizen, and he disappeared mysteriously in Hong Kong as well, and supposedly was a politically connected bagman for the CCP or something along those lines. I'm not exactly sure of all the details. I've forgotten some of it, unfortunately. But that was another case. One more interesting was Fan Bingbing, and she was detained and under the idea that she wasn't paying taxes appropriately, so that created substantial they had to create substantial pressure on her to return what she should to the economy. And then there is a case, of course, of Jack Ma, who went out of the public eye for a number of months early in the 2020s, and that was a prelude to the point that there was going to be a crackdown on some businesses, such as e-commerce or other related businesses, and education as well. I mention this point because often the CCP will signal to the world or to the external advisors about what's going to happen next. So recall information versus influence. There's never going to be an influence strategy that works in a government that has few constraints on its power. That's just a simple reflection of that situation. So under that situation, what do we want to do? We want to become better attuned to the information that comes from that economy or from that government so that we can act accordingly. So when we see signals being given, such as Jack Ma being detained, then maybe we need to think, hey, maybe there's something deeper to that than just that one detention. In other words, that one detention is symbolic of what might occur going into the future. Even when we saw China pivot from COVID-0 to COVID-100, there were very clear indications given that this was going to occur. Quite quickly, the staycation period for entrance to China went from 15 or 21 days of quarantine down to 10, down to 5, down to 3. And we know with COVID, 10, 5, 3, 5, and 3 are meaningless because of the incubation period, so on and so forth. So really, this was an indication that, hey, it was going to be COVID-0 to COVID-100. So we shouldn't have been so surprised when this actually was implemented. So there's many kinds of signaling, and one of the important signaling ones we'll talk about in class is actually the 5-year plans. These are projected, they're followed, and we need to place a lot of faith in these to show what's going to happen. So with this crackdown on corruption, we know this is really important. There's been an estimated 1.5 million government officials punished for corruption since 2012. Now, what is happening within China, or what is fascinating, is when there's a policy that wants to be created, the administrative apparatus is adjusted to facilitate the creation of that policy. And one of the I'm running out of adjectives. One of the fascinating things, or one of the most intriguing things, or one of the unique features, or one of the eye-catching features of China is that its administrative apparatus is incredibly efficient. And with the centralization of power, and then the creation of conduits by which that power can be connected to the rest of the economy, we can see policies being implemented with incredible speed and effectiveness. So I'll talk about a few of these examples as I go through the last 13 slides that I have here. One of these was the creation of the CCDI. CCDI exists both at the state level as well as the provincial level. This is the Central Commission for Disciplinary Inspection, now giving its name here, Shuanghui, which replaced the former National Supervisory Commission, or Liuzhi, right? So this was a body that's created to discipline individuals where it's independent of the standard judicial system. So people who fall under the eye of the CCDI will perhaps be engaged in this detain and retrain kind of system, without really going to the courts initially. So it's not a case of serve with a warrant, go to a court, so on and so forth. This is more that, hey, CCDI suspects something, and then the individual will fall under their control and command for a certain period in time. So that becomes a body that's very effective for prosecuting these kinds of policies with respect to corruption reduction. So when we see these kinds of bodies being created, and when we see the consolidation of power in the CCP, this has granted Xi Jinping and his party, or his faction, pardon me, more authority and more autonomy. Is it good for the economy? Is it good for business? And again, we don't really know 100% what are the reasons for all of these changes, but we do know some of the rhetoric around it, and we can look at potential evidence to see whether they're helpful or not. So a rhetoric around a lot of this is that, hey, this is being done to stem corruption. Corruption was allowed to grow to some degree in China at some point in time because it helped the transition from a centrally planned to a market-based economy. And one of the challenges in moving from centrally planned to a market-based is allowing market-based institutions to coordinate exchange instead of having a central exchange or a command kind of economy. In a command kind of economy where people control the flows of resources, independent price mechanisms, well, that creates a lot of opportunities for connections, networks, and so forth in order to gain those kinds of resources instead of market-based mechanisms. So as that shifts, and to the extent of what shift the occurs, how do we make sure that those decisions that reside in the hands of individuals with respect to distribution of resources, responsibilities, so on and so forth, are made with an economic logic and not for any other reason? And that's part of the corruption crackdown to help that happen. And in fact, when we look at numbers here, and again, this graphic didn't come out very well, but the second bar here is corruption is one of the biggest problems for doing business in China. The other is tax rates, and tax rates are somewhat unpredictable, which also reflects the lack of influence in the economy and the ability of leaders to operate very, very quickly with respect to decision making and implementation. Now, when the corruption reduction started, we can look to the balance sheets of companies to see what happened with respect to their spending on entertainment and travel costs. So one of the budgetary items we can see on the balance sheets of companies in China is something called ETC. But ETC is basically a catch-all of, hey, this is all the money we spend, which might not be receipted, but we're going to call it entertainment and travel costs because we always don't get receipts for entertainment, travel, so on and so forth, but we put it into this fund. So it's almost like a slush fund, but basically it's the idea that we have this loose area of accounting. After this was created, after this crackdown started, we saw ETC really being driven down. Now, if ETC is driven down, which is discretionary expenditure that's not related to the productive activities of a company, then we're just basically chopping out a cost without influencing the efficiency of production, providing trading activities still occur as they should occur. All right? So again, we're cutting out a cost, but we're cutting out a cost that's not critical to the efficiency of production or to the effectiveness of sales. So necessarily our margins should fatten. If our margins are fattening, then this should be reflected in a higher valuation of the company. And indeed, our Dean Bernard Young, our former Dean Bernard Young, found this in a study that he did, where he did a very simple event study. Basically, we had the orange and the blue lines, which are representative of either red share or listed companies in Hong Kong or all other companies. And the event window is when the crackdown on corruption started. If indeed we are enabling companies to become more efficient, if we are indeed eliminating unnecessary costs from those companies, then that should be reflected in a positive valuation outcome as reflected in an efficient market such as a Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And indeed, that's what was reflected in this graph here. We're comparing those red shares to the other non-China related companies. We saw a substantial elevation in their market value. This would suggest that, hey, there is some validity to the story that corruption is being reduced and that we're enabling companies to be more effective or more profitable, I guess is another way to put it, in their production of their goods. So that's some kind of evidence that would support the corruption story as being a positive outcome. Now, I mentioned about the bureaucracy. And just a little bit on this, and as it connects to the state-owned enterprises. So China has actually done a reasonably good job of managing a gradual transition of the state-owned enterprises to the market-based economy. Different countries have had different levels of success. Many Eastern European countries did not succeed very well in their big bang transitions. Others that have been more slow, like China, have not done as well. And again, I attribute this to the idea that the administrative infrastructure is really intelligently designed. And that's part of the bureaucracy that guides the economy, given these dictates. Now, the challenge is that this bureaucracy is so uniquely motivated to focus on the goals of the CCP that they become incredibly effective at the one or two goals that they're asked to achieve, which might mute the pursuit of other goals or might limit the ability to pursue multiple goals in the economy. So, for example, I don't know if you can see this very well, but there's a body called SASAC, S-A-S-A-C, and they're responsible for the administration of the SOEs. There's central SASAC and there's provincial SASACs as well. What they do is provide effective oversight, almost like a board of directors or a supervisory board for these SOEs. And they help the SOEs, or they encourage the SOEs to follow certain directives. So for a period of time during China's transition through the 80s and early 1990s, SOEs were not quite as focused on economic incentives as they should be, or economic outcomes for those SOEs. At that particular point in time, there was a multiple diverse responsibilities for the supervision of SOEs that led the SOEs to have a lot of flexibility in what they were able to do. When SASAC was created, this centralized the authority structure, or the guidance structure, or one might want to say the governance structure of the SOEs, and then made them much more beholden towards that one body. With that singular body in place, and with the directive from SASAC to pursue economic goals, we saw actually a big change in the way that SOEs operated. So for a long period of time, the output to asset ratio of what we could say as one measure of efficiency of SOEs versus non-SOEs was much lower. But after the creation of SASAC, which is indicated by this vertical line over here, the output asset ratio of SOEs increased substantially. So what was the idea is that the SOEs were being shifted from their social function, which was to provide not only jobs, but also education, housing, and so on and so forth, to focusing more on economic growth, and that was implemented by SASAC. So with the creation of SASAC, the what we can say the linearization of the command structure, SOEs became extremely responsive. And when a new rule was created, it was implemented. And there are other features of the administrative apparatus within China, such as a promotion structure, so on and so forth, that facilitated that need and ability to listen to those above and implement well. But this is just one example. So there's a history of these kinds of SOE reforms and supervisory agencies that I leave you to review since 1978, but it's basically China's ability to experiment quickly with various kinds of administrative structures and eventually finding the one that works. So that kind of agility within administration is also something that's really, really interesting to look at, that goes part and parcel with the ability to implement the reforms that are planned at a centralized level. So it's all well and good to have an autocracy. It's all well and good to have a long-term vision. It's all well and good to have a consistent vision and an enduring vision of what needs to be done in the economy. But at the end of the day, we got to get this stuff done, which means we need the administrative apparatus, and we need to be able to develop and adapt that to the various situations that occur. And I think to most observers of China, the adaptability and flexibility of this system and resilience of the system has been much, much greater than what people expected, leading to the sustained growth, and for 30 years, up until the last couple of years, unparalleled history of expansion without any contraction in the economy. That is just basically unseen. But anyway, I leave this here for you to review of your own interest to see what's happened with the supervisory agencies. One of the more interesting things that happened recently with respect to the SOEs is that after this period of economic enhancement of focus, which was about a 20-year period, 15 to 20-year period, there was an idea that, hey, maybe the SOEs are becoming too market focused and they're forgetting about their social responsibility. So we pushed them in one direction. Now all of a sudden we realize that direction's gone too far, so how do we pull it back? So around 2017, 2018, there was a charter amendment for SOEs that changed the fundamental governance structure, as well as the managerial team structure, leadership team structure for these companies. Essentially, what it did is it seeded more party people into the SOEs, and the idea was the more that the party people were there, the more they would be beholden to party-related goals, given that this was consistent with these individuals' job descriptions and their orientations as well. So they were told to do this. That was SOEs were told to do this. Reconstitute your management teams and reconstitute your boards. And you have to have certain people from the CCP in certain kinds of positions as indicated here. And one of the remarkable things is this happened really quickly. Because they're listed companies, they just can't go ahead and do this. They have to change their charters and so on and so forth. But when this was announced, 9 months later, 75% or 60 some odd percent of these companies had already changed their charters to accommodate this new directive. Again, indicating the effectiveness of the administrative system in China. Another interesting thing about the administrative system in China is that for any city, there's always a mayor and a party secretary, each of whom have a corresponding sphere of power, with maybe the mayor focus more on economic growth as their primary KPI for determining their success, whereas a party secretary was emphasizing maybe other goals, such as those connected to party objectives that were not economic. So we had this interesting balancing power through this dual leadership structure, and we could go into a lot more detail than that, but being that I'm already at 42 minutes and 8 seconds into this video, we're not going to go into it. So, in summary, what's been done? Infrastructure has been done. Inflows of capital done. Building human capital, great progress. Stemming corruption, in promise. Do we need to constrain political power? Really interesting, because this is the inverse of the stemming corruption. Political power has become less constrained, not more constrained over time, whereas many, many people were projecting that as China's economy grew, it would grow into a multi-party state. But if one looks into a 5,000 year history, I challenge you to find when China was ever a multi-party state. Maybe there are epochs that I don't know about, but I would say there's always been a history, or at least a dominant history, of centralized authority as the guiding governance structure for China. So why would we expect otherwise going forward? Very interesting questions to think about, and something that we'll discuss in class. So what are some of these questions again? What will be the success of homegrown innovation attempts in China in the 2020s? We'll discuss that. What is required to make it more successful? What's been happening with the IPP environment? What role will foreign firms play and foreign economies play? We need to discuss that. How would you choose to compete in China, given these situations? How would you choose, if you're a domestic firm from China, choose to compete in international markets? Fascinating stuff. And what do you need to do to better understand the business environment? And there's lots that we'll discuss that connect to all of these issues, and we'll try to put this information together, and we'll try really hard to develop a unbiased and information-based perspective on what's happening in terms of the progression of China in general terms, what's happened since 2012, why was economic growth achieved, what does it mean when we talk about social stability, what does it mean when we talk about common prosperity, and so on and so forth. So what do we expect to happen in the future? And we'll discuss all of these, and I'm looking forward to that discussion, and that should take me to the end of this video. And there we go. Don't forget to complete the quiz that accompanies this video, and I hope you've learned something that can be helpful to you about understanding this very, very large, complicated, exciting, and important economy to the world. Thank you.